Hi, I am Shanta Gander, and I'm here with Shin who is an artist across many different mediums, to talk about her page for our anthology, Sign and Breath. Welcome, Shin.
Thank you.
So, Shin, you had a piece to read. Why don't we start with the piece that you want to read, that you want to share with us?
Sure. I'm going to read Heyday. Heyday. During the logging boom, loss and gain, the old growth forests, Pacific red cedar and fir, felled to create the city's earliest trade, timber. Woodlands clear cut, with logs rolled, skidded down roads to arrive at a new understory. What a sampling of Sylvain say about the now. Memory, a series of concentric rings. 1,000 acres to be brought into active trust. The city of tree stewards recover the watershed. Cultivate urban vegetation. Extend the forest canopy to change the temperature.
And one of the things that everyone will notice in the anthology itself is how visual that piece is. So I'd be just so curious about why this page, like why you chose it to represent, Sign and Breath, and what was some of your process with its coming into being and being so visual.
Yeah, so I think for this anthology, I was thinking about this notion of sign, and it felt to me like a visual format could be something interesting to do with a page. And so my excerpt is actually screenshots or stills of an animated video poem that I created back in 2017 with Michael Barakat, a designer and filmmaker. And the idea with that particular piece is that we took a poem, that I had, written on the page, and I had this idea of how I want it designed and executed. I have worked a bit in the past with visual or concrete poetry, shaped poems in terms of creating visual formats for representing my work. But when I went to my collaborator, Michael, I talked to him specifically about how we could maybe push that a little bit and make it more animated and more dynamic. So I showed him examples of visual poems by people like Ian Hamilton Finley and Guillaume Apollinaire, and this kind of tradition of concrete poetry, and then talked about the ways in which I wanted to apply that to animating this piece that I'd written about an environmental initiative that was happening in the city of Redmond, where I was poet laureate at the time. So I think that this particular piece kind of represents some of the ways in which I like to work visually or with text to kind of I guess, disrupt or play with the reading experience. And as a video poem, it's not one that has any voiceover, for instance. So the ways in which the phrases are kind of broken up visually give some sense of how the work might be read, or like where the breath might fall. So that was kind of the origins of the work and the idea of submitting it to the anthology.
What I'm interested in is what, like, this actually brings the question of voice into another level, into another realm. So as we think about voice and orality, this also brings into the question or the idea of the animated voice, the voice that becomes a visual thing. Can you speak to that? Like, when did you know that you first wanted to play with language or voice or orality in that way?
Well, I think that my sensibility around the notion of voice has certainly evolved since I made this poem, Heyday. But to talk about maybe what was going on at the time that I made it. So I was the poet laureate of this city that's, kind of like a sister city to Seattle, Redmond, on the east side where Microsoft is, Bill Gates, et cetera, right? And I was in this civic poet role where, I'm being asked by the city to present my work to thousands of people and to find the kind of right format for that. And after doing a couple of kind of like large civic events with lots and lots of people, I really felt that the right move wasn't being on a stage and using the voice to read a poem. It didn't seem really effective because, when folding poetry into like a large civic festival around like the holidays or whatever the theme is, people aren't necessarily really there to listen to poetry. It's not the right occasion for it or the right format to necessarily present that. So I began to think about what it would mean to sort of take my voice and body out of the reading experience. And that was where this idea of like the visual concrete poem that exists as an animation projected on a building on City Hall at night could, invite the reader to play around with reading or encountering poetry and text in a very visual way. And I'll say that, at that time, I think that, again, my sensibilities hadn't yet shifted, but I was kind of like interested in this notion of removing my voice and my body, like who I am as like a BIPOC person in the world, from the reading experience, because I wanted to know if people would respond to that work differently if they didn't know that it was written by a woman, or that it was, the product of like, a BIPOC poet, right? I just wondered if there would be any difference in how it would be perceived if it was like there was this like anonymity of the author. So that interested me. But I think what I realized was then there was this level of erasure that I was enacting on myself and making myself invisible and literally not giving myself a voice. So that's not what I do now, and that's not what I'm interested in. But I think that it was a part of the experimentation to see what are the different ways in which voice can show up or be removed, or how can you represent voice in different ways, and to give the reader or the viewer some cues about how something might be experienced, but to give them a lot of autonomy over the reading or, kind of deep listening type experience in silence, right? And I don't think of the work in that way anymore. Like, I think that for that period of time when I made the piece, it was interesting and effective for the thing that I was trying to do, but isn't how I think about the voice now.
I would love to hear how your definition of voice has changed over time, like between like at the time heyday, or maybe just before
Yeah.
its conception to now. Like, what is your definition of voice, and what have you noticed that perhaps has surprised you about how the definition for you has shifted?
Yeah, so voice for me now is very much about agency and visibility and the claiming of voice. So, there have been like a lot of things that have happened in the world since 2017, and I would say that, beginning with the start of the pandemic and the anti-Asian sentiments that arose during the Trump administration, those were very impactful. And those were followed by, in March 2021, the massacre of 6 Asian women in the Atlanta spa shootings. And so those particular occasions and this climate of anti-Asian bias and discrimination have really, I think, touched me in a very deep way to reconsider and reimagine what it means to have a voice and to be able to use it. So I think certainly in the socio-political context also of just, yeah, having, I think, as an Asian woman, maybe chosen certain cultural ways of being in the past, and really realizing that those aren't things that are sustainable or healthy for me, especially as somebody who is the mother now to a young mixed race child, that one must absolutely use one's voice to make space for the community and for certain marginalized experiences. So there's that layer of things. But, for much of my life, I was always very interested in the voice as an instrument, to the degree that when I was a young person, I participated in a lot of, vocal jazz ensembles and, classical choirs all the way up to college, took a lot of voice lessons, auditioned, for music school that really didn't work out at all. And then kind of took a little break for a long time from singing, and where there were opportunities to sing and use the voice as an instrument, as a vehicle, that those opportunities were interesting to me. And in the last year, I've taken up voice lessons with a wonderful teacher who was based here in Seattle for a long time, but is now based in Los Angeles, Jessica Kenny. And so Jessica is a really interesting vocalist who has trained in a lot of non-Western music. And I think that in the work with her, I have thought a lot about what it means to decolonize the voice and to kind of decondition it from the ways in which we may be trained in Western traditions to think of the voice or to sing in certain ways. And so, like, the voice now for me, and as I think of it when I write or perform, is very much, I think, about an expression of the spirit, and that connecting to something that is beyond words, that the voice can be incorporated into a performance in a way that isn't simply about the reading or the performing of language, but can also be about inviting the body in, embodiment, and inviting listeners in to really just be present in a different way when the voice is animated as an instrument of spirit, I'd say.
I'm very curious about something you said as we wrap up. What does it mean? Like, if you were to give a brief description of what does it mean to decolonize the voice? It's something I'd not thought of. Thought about the decolonizing of, language, as it were, but voice, decolonizing the voice that lives like in our body. What does that look like or even sound like, in your opinion?
Well, there are a couple dimensions of that, So for me, for instance, like in my, late teens, when I was preparing for a music audition, the music that was given to me by my classically trained opera singer voice teacher was like, you're gonna like perform this Brahms song or the Schubert song, and this is the thing, like the Western operatic art song tradition. Even though I got no interest in singing in that way, like this is the thing that you're going to present to these musical conservatory people because that's the canon. So there's that layer of the privileging of the European. But on a whole another level, right now I've been doing a lot of writing for radio. And so that involves script writing and the reading of a text, right? And some of the feedback I've gotten during the taping sessions have been very interesting to me. At one point, it was suggested that I should kind of, calibrate my reading to a neutral voice. So then I had a long conversation with my voice teacher about what is this thing called neutral voice? Should I push back about that? Because who's neutral voice? What is neutral voice? And the idea of like neutral voice, like radio voice, may actually be a white male voice, right? And is that kind of neutral voice, is it neutral, first of all? It's not really, right? But then it's also like, is that the voice that I want to perform and deploy to seem like girl next door, right? To be approachable to an audience, right? And I think along with that, it's like, can I choose neutral voice if like the stories that I'm telling about Asian Americans and underrepresented communities are the community, right? So I'm being the neutral girl next door performing a certain kind of voice, but you know what? We're in a different neighborhood. Like, is there a way in which I can make those choices? So these are just some of the ways in which I think about voice these days, because I am able to write for the voice in many different kind of mediums, which then make me really consider, what relationship do I have to my voice right now? Is it representative of who I am or who I feel myself to be? And, how do I want to relate to voice?
That's a very interesting thought too, because I am also doing a lot of radio stuff, and I have a radio series that I'm working with. And so this, even listening to myself and saying, is this even, or am I getting too excited, or am I being this kind of Shanta? Like say, ooh, girl, like I can't say that in my radio segment, so, but why can't I say that in my radio segment? So I love this. Is there anything you want to add as we wrap up? Is there a question I did not ask, or anything you would like to add about just some of the concepts or thoughts that you've had around this piece, or in general?
The piece itself, just to give some brief context, basically the city was developing an environmental initiative for which they were trying to, really gather some support from the community. And specifically, they were wanting to become better environmental stewards by extending their tree canopy, which affects their water, basically their watershed. And so, it was an interesting piece to think about, because I didn't want to write a propaganda piece, but, I was really interested in the city's history of environmental stewardship and moments when that hasn't worked so well, like, overlogging, right? So really bringing that into the story or the narrative as, you know, in order to understand the present, you have to understand the past. And so that was very important to me in creating a piece that could be thoughtful. And the images themselves, they derive from shaping the words in the poem into these images of trees and the environment. And so that was kind of the thought or the different strategies that went into making that piece.
Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure talking with you. Give me 1 second, just hold on, I'm going to stop recording.